Good afternoon and welcome everyone. Welcome to our webinar on salt reduction. My name is Elizabeth Joldeski and I'm leading the Food Industry Liaison on behalf of the Heart Foundation and the Victorian Salt Reduction Partnership. Thank you for taking the time to join our webinar today, and thank you for your interest in learning how you can implement a salt reduction reformulation program in your own food manufacturing business. Today, we're going to give you a detailed insight into the 9 steps to salt reduction that have been set out in Australia's first salt reduction how-to guide, which I've got here in my hot little hands. You can also download a copy of it for yourselves right now. Please go to the resources button on the top right-hand side of the screen. And please do that now, as we will be referring to the guide all throughout the webinar today. We do have a lot of detail to get through, but we will be allowing questions and answers at the end of the webinar. We've got 15 minutes allocated for that. So please start to put forward your questions right now. Again, you can do so. Just go to the raise hand icon. Again, that's in the top right-hand corner of your screen. So as I said, we've got a lot to go through, so let's get started. Okay, firstly, we just wanted to provide you with a little bit of background on the Victorian Salt Reduction Partnership, and we also wanted to quickly put the effect of too much salt into perspective. So in terms of the implications of too much salt, most of you would know that Australians are eating a lot of it, but we're actually eating almost double the amount of salt than we should. That's around 9 grams, when the recommendation from the World Health Organization and the Heart Foundation is 5 grams a day. Now, eating too much salt is no good for you, and it does lead to high blood pressure, and this is a risk factor for cardiovascular diseases, stroke, kidney disease, and even some cancers like stomach cancer. Actually, 1 in 3 Australians have high blood pressure, and that's around 30% of the population. What a lot of people probably don't know is where that salt is coming from. Most people actually think that because they don't add salt at the table or during their cooking, then they think that their salt intake is okay. But this is not the case. What most people don't know is that around 75% of the salt in our diets is coming from processed and packaged foods. And salt is hidden in these processed and packaged foods, and it's in everyday foods, it's also in core foods, it's even in foods that you don't think are necessarily salty, like sweet goods and muffins and baked goods and so on. So it is almost impossible to know how much we're eating and where it comes from. But eating too much salt is preventable, and if the population reduced their salt intake by just 30%, this equates to 3,200 lives saved and around $200 million saved in healthcare costs in Australia. And because salt matters and because we can do something about it, VicHealth established the Victorian Salt Reduction Partnership in 2014 to work in a collaborative approach together on salt reduction in Victoria. And the Heart Foundation is leading the implementation of this project, and we're working with the George Institute for Global Health in conjunction with VicHealth. And you can see all of our other health partners, public health partners on this slide. Our other partners include the Stroke Foundation, Deakin University, Kidney Australia, and the CSIRO. So in terms of the approach that the Salt Partnership has taken with our salt reduction program, we've been delivering an integrated approach to salt reduction over the last 2 years. And I'm really happy to report that we're having great success across all of the areas that we've been involved in. Our approach is focused on 3 key areas, which are set out in this slide. Firstly, we're very focused on educating consumers and raising awareness in the community about the dangers of eating too much salt. And we do this through regularly releasing food category reports, and this is research that the George Institute for Global Health undertakes, which highlights the highest and lowest salt levels in processed foods on Australian supermarket shelves. And you can actually access and download full copies of these food category reports if you go to our website, which is unpackthesalt.com.au. Our second strategic approach is to advocate mainly to the federal government and to advocate strongly for policy change in this area. We need the federal government to finalise voluntary targets, not just for sodium, but also for sugar and saturated fats. And this is through a Commonwealth Healthy Food Partnership process, which is currently still taking place. We're also asking the government to better measure and monitor changes in population salt intake, and we also need a national healthy eating campaign. The third and final piece, which is set out on this slide and which we'll be focusing on very much today, is the food manufacturing industry engagement. It's really critical that you work closely with food manufacturers to seek their support to reformulate and to produce healthier foods. And even the World Health Organization recognises the really important role that the food manufacturing industry plays in salt reduction. They call it a best buy, and that it's a really critical way to go about preventing non-communicable diseases and to reduce salt intake. And this is very much the reason why the Victorian Salt Reduction Partnership has been working in this multi-sectoral approach, educating consumers, advocating to government, but also, most importantly, working collaboratively with industry, because we want to ensure that this collective responsibility, this shared responsibility, and that everybody acts together to reduce the amount of salt in processed and packaged foods. So in terms of the industry engagement approach, what have we been doing over the last couple of years? Well, we've been contacting Australia's major food companies that produce most of the processed foods that ends up on our supermarket shelves. We've contacted over 50 companies, and we've engaged and developed close relationships with over 20 of Australia's major food companies. Now, the focus of this industry engagement has been to firstly uncover and showcase the progress that's being made in Australia, and there has been some really good and considerable progress. If you go to our website, unpackthesalt.com.au, you'll see the 6 case studies that we've developed with major food companies, including Barilla, Woolworths, Unilever, Nestle, PepsiCo, amongst others. The second objective with our industry engagement program is to acknowledge that there is a lot more work that needs to be done. And that's why the Salt Partnership has developed a suite of initiatives. We've developed grants, Victorian Salt Reduction industry grants. We've developed benchmarking reports. We've also hosted some events for the industry, all aimed at inspiring, encouraging and supporting food manufacturers that aren't currently reformulating to actually do it. So, and that's exactly why we developed this how-to guide, as we saw a huge gap in Australia in the level of technical knowledge and resourcing for reformulation, especially amongst smaller food manufacturers who you'd probably know are very time and resource poor. And we are determined to fill this information and capability gap, and we're thrilled to have worked with Vanessa Clarkson, who wrote and authored the guide, the how-to guide, and we're thrilled to have her here today to take you through it in detail and to share her expert views with you. Vanessa is Australia's leading reformulation expert. She's worked with major retailers and suppliers, not just here. She's worked with Coles in Australia, but also with Asda in the UK. And she's also chaired the Healthy Food Partnership Reformulation Program. So I'll now hand over to Vanessa, who'll deliver the webinar and help you to be reformulation ready. Thanks, Vanessa.
Thanks, Liz. So a warm welcome from me for today's webinar on salt reduction. We're really pleased that you can join us and learn about the steps and considerations in designing your own salt reduction programme. In terms of what we're going to cover today, we'll start by looking at salt intakes, what they are, why they are a problem, where salt is coming from in our diets, and the functions of it in food that lead to such widespread use of it, both in the home, but as Liz has mentioned, more significantly in manufactured foods. We'll then take you through the 9 key steps that you would need to consider when creating your own salt reduction programme. So the main aim for today is to enable manufacturers to build into their product development cycle a level of focus on the salt content and the ingredients in your recipes, with a view to improving what is going into the food supply to make it easier for people to consume healthier diets. Now, of course, In today's webinar, we're turning our attention to salt, but there's no reason that most of the principles that we go through today couldn't apply when looking at the overall mix of ingredients that go into a product. So let's kick off and let's look at salt more closely to understand why we are looking at ways to reduce its consumption. Salt is 40% sodium, 60% chloride, and both of these are essential nutrients, meaning that we can't survive without them. Sodium in particular is needed to maintain fluid balance, and in other words, what we mean by that is that fluid balance is ensuring the correct balance of water within and around our body cells. It's also essential for blood pressure, and it plays a role in transmitting nerve impulses. However, the actual amount of sodium our bodies need is minuscule in comparison to how much is consumed in modern diets. This has been estimated to be somewhere around 500 milligrams of sodium per day, or that's the equivalent to about 1.25 grams of salt, similar to what our hunter-gatherer ancestors would have gotten through diets based on plants and wild fish and game. Probably as a result of it being essential to survival, salt is also one of our basic tastes. However, the preference we have for a certain level of salt is learned through repeated experiences. And today, people are readily accustomed to diets that are high in salt without necessarily realising them to be so. With high salt intakes, the body, or more specifically the kidneys, can have trouble keeping up with clearing the excess sodium from the blood. To deal with this and to dilute the sodium, the body ends up holding on to extra water, which increases the body's fluid volume and creates more work for the heart and pressure on the blood vessels. Over time, this can lead to high blood pressure, a heart attack, stroke, or heart failure. Chronic kidney disease also shares some of the same risk factors of cardiovascular disease. For those people with high blood pressure, it does appear that high salt intakes also add further to the risk of developing chronic kidney disease. In terms of osteoporosis, the amount of calcium that your body loses increases with the amount of salt in the diet. As calcium levels need to be tightly maintained, the body releases calcium from the bones to compensate. Eventually, this can lead to a softening of the bones and osteoporosis. And finally, if we didn't have enough of a reason to be concerned, higher salt intakes have been concluded to be a probable cause of stomach cancer by the World Cancer Research Fund. If we look now at typical salt intakes in the Australian population, we find that on average they are almost double the recommended maximum of 5 grams a day set by the World Health Organization. Intakes are generally higher in men owing to their greater overall food consumption. And at a population level, these high levels of salt that are consumed add up to significant burdens to society. It's been estimated that 1 in every 20 deaths in Victoria can be attributed to high salt intakes. And if salt intakes were reduced in line with recommended limits, this would save around 800 lives and $50 million in healthcare costs. And that's just for Victoria. Okay, so salt intakes are clearly a problem. Let's look at the leading contributors to intakes in the Australian diet. This chart is showing data that's taken from the Australian Health Survey, which was last published in 2011-12. So it's a little bit out of date, but we can be reasonably sure that the leading contributors today are similar to what is shown here. Of course, many of these products are obviously salty if we think about processed meats and sauces, for example, but products don't necessarily have to taste salty for them to be a key contributor. Breakfast cereals are an example where they're more likely to taste sweet than salty, for example, and sweet baked goods would be another. What we can see here are those categories that contribute the most salt to diets, either because they are particularly high in salt at a product level, such as processed meats or cheese, or because they might be consumed in large amounts or regularly, such as bread and bread rolls. These, along with other grain-based dishes such as pizza, pasta and noodles, are leading contributors to salt in Australian diets. Now, importantly, if you're looking at this and thinking your product category does not appear on this list, that's not to say that we do not need to look at what you can do to reduce salt. As you will come on to see, broad changes in salt levels across the entire food supply are important to support with adjusting people's palates downwards. Okay, so why is it so? Why is there so much salt in the food supply? Well, salt can perform a number of important technical functions and it's low cost, so it's easy to see why it's so prevalent in the food supply and why consumption is so high when diets are so heavily geared towards manufactured foods. Indeed, estimates vary but suggest people typically get about 75% of their salt from foods in which they've had no hand in preparing. Now, the most obvious function that most people will be aware of for salt is its ability to boost flavour, and this works in both sweet and savoury applications, of course. So for instance, it's not uncommon at all to find cake recipes in cookbooks that use a pinch of salt in a sweet cake or cookie mix. What I think is important to remember when it comes to taste is that very much in the same way that people can be accustomed to high salt intakes, the reverse is also true. And studies generally show that people's palates can settle and come to appreciate a lower salt level in foods after around 3 months of consuming less in their diet. This means too that we need to be thinking of reducing salt across the food supply, not just in those categories that people appreciate as being salty or high salt contributors. For people's palates to adjust, broad, sweeping changes will need to happen. In terms of preservation, salt has obviously had a very long history of use as a preservative and undoubtedly performs this as an essential role in some product applications. The way it does this is to reduce the amount of water that is available, and moisture is an important substrate that microbes need to grow. In modern food supplies, salt is just one of the ways in which we can preserve food, but there are other options such as refrigeration, canning, freezing and so on. And so whether salt performs this preservative function is very much dependent on the specific product in question. And lastly, what we mean by processability here is salt's clever role as an ingredient to perform technical functions. Obvious examples of this might be the handling of dough for bread or other grain-based goods. The word processability here should not be linked to just manufactured foods. For instance, if you make bread by hand, you are still going to need to add salt to control the action of the yeast, as an example. Okay. So we've looked at why salt intakes are a concern, where salt is coming from and why. Let's now look at what we can do about it. So if you don't already have a copy of the Reformulation Readiness Guide, you can go ahead and download it now. So just pop onto the Resources tab in the top right-hand corner of your screen, and with any luck, this will launch a PDF copy for you to access. It's a great idea to have this to hand while I run through the steps from it in case you want to make any notes. Okay. So now in the guide, we've outlined 9 key steps that would typically form part of developing your own reformulation program. Whether or not you need every single step and whether they would fall in this particular order would very much be down to your own business, your product development cycles, and the time and resources available for you to do this. To that end, these steps serve as a guide of the sorts of things that you may need to consider. So I'll read through these. So firstly, determine nutrition composition, complete competitor benchmarking, consider communication options, establish targets and timeframes, obviously reformulate the product, check the new salt content, complete shelf life testing if that may have been impacted, check the salt content of the factory trial, and then the product is obviously in the market. So we'll go through these now one by one. So as we're talking about reformulating products, I'm assuming here that we have a product that we want to look at improving the recipe for. Now, and at various points through the reformulation programme, you are going to need to know how much salt you're dealing with. You have a good understanding of this when you look at your specification, of course, but to supply this information to consumers on the label, then we need to know levels more precisely. You will be familiar with the various different ways of determining the nutritional composition of products, of course, the two main ones being to use already published data, or you can send your product off to a lab and they can analyse it for you. Both of these are perfectly fine for labelling purposes. There are pros and cons to each, and this affects which method you will want to adopt and at what point in the product development cycle. With the published data, you can get this in hard copy or in online databases. There are a number available. You can also get software that are connected to these databases and allow you to input your ingredient information, and it will calculate for you what the end product nutrition information should be. Published data can be more or less accurate depending on the product in question. But because today we're talking more specifically about manufactured foods with multiple ingredients and processing steps, then I would generally say that it can be less accurate and only useful as a guide. If I were wanting to label a bag of almonds or flour, however, I'd usually go for published data because these databases are usually made up of a number of data sources that are then averaged out. With the lab analysis, the lab can usually guide you on what is best practice, but generally we would say that it's a good idea to do 3 samples from different batches and ideally at the end of shelf life. Labs usually need a week or 2 to turn around your sample analysis before they can email over the nutrition report, so you need to factor that into your planning. Okay, so I thought it would be a great idea to work through a real-life example to show you how I would approach things. So we're in the world of Vanessa's pizza brand, which I couldn't think of a wonderful name for, so we'll just have to go with that. And we're looking at improving the recipe of our pepperoni pizza. I already have the nutritional composition of it because it's been on the market for a while now, but we're wanting to see what we can do to improve the recipe. We're going to look at how our pizza stacks up against the marketplace through a benchmarking exercise. If you like, as part of the suite of resources developed for Unpack the Salt, you can download an Excel spreadsheet that will help you to collate all the information that you might want to consider when doing this. And again, to access that, simply click through the Resources tab now or at the end of the presentation to do that. Okay, so here's one I made earlier, as they used to say on Blue Peter. This is a cut of the Excel tool that I just mentioned. There are further columns to this, which I won't go through now as there are instructions on this sheet, but it just gives you an idea of things. So this data I'm showing is real life. I gathered my data from retailer and brand websites, and what I have put up here is the random order that I came to look at these products. In other words, it was completely by chance, if you would believe, that the first pepperoni pizza that I came across happened to be the saltiest. So in terms of where you are going to get this information, the most obvious source is a product label. You might also be able to find what you're after online, whether that's a retailer or a brand website, or you could try the Food Switch app or website. Things that you want to look at are the salt content per 100 grams against similar products. Comparing per 100 grams removes any effect that portion size may have. But it's also good to look at how much salt or sodium is in a serving of a product and compare this to the reference intake, which for sodium is 2300 milligrams. And for something like pizza or anything really that's a full meal, ideally you wouldn't want to go over about 30% of the reference intake for salt. So we're talking here, I really wouldn't want my pizza to be providing more than 700 milligrams of sodium or about 1.7 grams of salt in a serving if you think that most people consume at least 3 meals a day. So we'll come back to setting targets shortly, but just for information, the 450 sodium target that I have used here is the draft target that was proposed under the Healthy Food Partnership. And you can see that unfortunately I have quite a way to go to bring my pizza in line with that level, almost a 40% drop. And that Excel spreadsheet calculates those differences to targets for you. Anything in the peach colour on the spreadsheet automatically calculates. So we've got a way to go. Okay, so the other thing you should be thinking at this stage, and this is often forgotten and left right till the end, is whether you are going to want to talk about your improvements on the label through any claims and such. So if you want to make claims specifically in relation to salt reduction, then there is certain criteria that you would need to meet. For instance, if you want to call out that it's now less salt, then it would need to be at least 25% less salt than the previous version, or when compared to a standard pepperoni pizza on the market. Other claims, such as low salt or no added salt, would not be possible in this case for a pizza, because at the very least you're always going to have salt in the base, even if it were a rather sad cheeseless pizza. Most brands choose to reformulate by stealth, in other words, not inform the consumer at the point of purchase that you've reduced the salt, because for consumers it can often signal that the product may not taste as nice, even if that isn't the case, which is confirmed through sensory testing. Some product categories do call out salt reduction though, especially where health is an important driver of choice. I'm probably not going to want to do that for my particular pizza, as I really feel that health is not an important driver of choice in this case. But I would like to be rewarded for the work that I've done to improve the recipe though. So I'm going to look at including health stars on the label and see if I can ensure that my pepperoni pizza is going to have the highest health star rating on the market of pepperoni pizzas. Now, you could probably have a whole webinar dedicated to how you optimise the health star rating, because reformulating against the health star rating is quite an involved process. But for brevity, I just wanted to point out where you would start if you wanted to look at reducing salt and be rewarded with a higher health star rating. Although I think it's important to point out at this stage that it's unlikely my pepperoni pizza is ever going to get a really high star rating, because it is a pizza after all. But we could at least look and see how close the sodium hurdles are. So if you remember, our pizza had a sodium content of 730 milligrams. So even just getting it down by 10 milligrams, which I've indicated with the giant arrow there, that may improve the overall score, though I would say it's hardly worth all the effort that we're going to with this exercise to only shuffle things down by 10 milligrams. So in this case, I'd be looking more at the 630 milligrams, which is the next hurdle, and seeing what that does to the overall rating of the product if that was achieved. I would also say that 630 milligrams is also more comparable to the market. So we can therefore use all the previous steps up to now to support us in developing our salt or sodium targets. If external targets already exist, you can of course use these to guide your endpoint and potentially set interim targets to help you get there in a stepwise manner. For pizza, I'd probably be looking at the 630 milligram hurdle that we saw with the health star rating, rather than going the whole hog to 450 milligrams at this stage. Now, just going back to that 450 milligram target, I just wanted to say that that came from the draft Healthy Food Partnership targets that were released at the end of last year. The development of those targets is still in train and has been delayed slightly with the election. However, they are available as a resource for manufacturers to consult when setting their own targets until such time that they are finalised, of course, bearing in mind that they may yet change. And again, you will find a link to those through the Resources tab at the top right. Your time frame depends in part on your target and your product development cycle, including any packaging and stock on hand. If you've got a big drop, then you're going to need more time to do that, especially if the reduction is more technically challenging, where salt is playing more of a functional role rather than just boosting the flavour. Next, we're going to do the actual reformulation with our development chefs. To help guide this, I would be looking at the ingredients list of my product and potentially of my competitor products and work out what ingredients are driving the salt content. So I've used the ingredients list here, but obviously you would have more detail than this in the product spec. I've just highlighted the main contributors to salt that stood out to me, and these are the sorts of areas I'd be exploring for this product. So could I reduce the salt in the base or use a thinner base? Could I find a lower salt pepperoni, cheese and or sauce? Could I change the ratio of toppings? Could I put more sauce, slightly less cheese and pepperoni? And what about the additives as well? There's a lot of sodium-based additives within this product. Could I do something there? As I say, I'd probably be looking quite closely at the competitors, especially those that have particularly low salt contents. So I could work out how they'd achieve that level. In this instance, I did find that my pizza, sadly, already had the lowest amount of pepperoni on it compared with my competitors, which, given is a defining feature of a pepperoni pizza, I didn't think it was something I'd be looking to reduce further at this stage. So I'd probably be exploring some of those other options first and foremost. So now I've got my kitchen sample and I'm pretty happy with how it's looking commercially and organoleptically. So I'm going to send this off to the lab to check its new salt content, and I'm also going to conduct some blind sensory analysis to check that it meets my quality standards. There are, of course, various ways of doing this that I'm sure you're already used to, and which one you choose depends on what your aim and objective of the exercise is. One example of how we could do this for the pizza is to test one of my new pizzas against a couple of my old recipe and see if consumers could spot a difference. And again, as I say, it depends whether you want consumers to spot a difference or not. It may be that you want them to have a noticeable difference. You want them to notice that you've improved the recipe. So you choose your method according to what your objective is. If all that went okay, then I'd get the new shelf life tested, because in this instance, I'd certainly expect that that would be impacted, especially because mine is a fresh rather than a frozen pizza. And all that looks great. So my new and improved product is going to go on the market. And if it's still on shelf in a year's time, then I'll revisit this process and look again at what I can achieve. Okay, so we're just going to recap now on what we've covered before we move on to questions. So Australians are consuming nearly double the recommended amount of salt, resulting in adverse health effects. Reformulation is one strategy to support consumers reduce their salt consumption. Leading contributors of salt in the Australian diets are grain-based products including bread and processed meats and soups. Salt can boost flavour as well as serve a number of technical functions. And your reformulation programme can be developed using the steps outlined in the best practice guide, which include determining an appropriate salt level and time frame for reformulation by understanding the market and existing targets, looking at various options for reformulation, whether that's reduction, replacement or removal, and then checking the impact of salt reduction on any sensory qualities and shelf life, and then regularly reviewing opportunities for further salt reduction.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Vanessa, for that very thorough overview of the 9 steps in our reformulation guide. We will now move to the question and answer session. So let's have a look at some of the questions that have been coming through. Okay, well, we have one question that's come through. The first question is whether there are any grants available for industry to reformulate. Fantastic question, and I think I referred in my introduction to the fact that the Victorian Salt Reduction Partnership has actually developed some grants. VicHealth, in conjunction with FIAL, has currently got some grants that are open and available for small to medium-sized manufacturers. You can actually gain access to up to $25,000 of grants funding and money to help you to look at whether you need to undertake the benchmarking work or whether you need to look at developing a reformulation program from scratch. So if anyone's interested in that grants program, they can email us and inquire at unpackthesalt@heartfoundation.org.au.
Okay.
And we also have another question that's come through.
I've got two.
Oh, fantastic. Okay, so we've got one about time. I think there was one about time frames. What are the best time frames and the length of time for our reformulation? Vanessa, would you like to answer that?
What time frames do you
recommend
for
the single product reformulation?
Yeah, so it really depends on, there's a lot of factors that you need to consider, which I sort of ran through. And so this is like how long is a piece of string sort of question. I mean, in my instance with that pizza, it was a 40% reduction. So that's several years, I would say, work to try and bring that down. So we normally say a 10% reduction at a time is reasonable. Whether or not you can push it further depends on, if we put aside for one moment the technical side of things, whether or not you can push it further from a flavour point of view, from a taste point of view, depends where you are against the market. You might taste really salty compared to the market, for example. You may also find that you can push it further than the 10%, so I wouldn't necessarily just use that as a guideline. You can always try and do some staged examples and put them all through your sensory testing and then see if consumers can spot. You may be able to push it further than that 10%. So probably a year gap between them is reasonable to go for, in my experience. And it can, depending on how many products you have in your portfolio, it can be quite an intense and involved process as well. So that's the other thing you want to balance. You could, of course, do it more regularly than that and take consumers on that journey more quickly, but that's a lot of work that goes in the back end to do that. So normally we say about a year at least.
Fantastic. And that's definitely echoed by all of the companies that we've engaged with, the 6 case studies that we've got on our unpackthesalt.com.au website. They all say make small reductions and do it incrementally and do it over a longer period. And that longer period is important, as Vanessa said, because you need to give consumers time to adjust. So that time frame is quite important. Okay, our next question is around the use of salt alternatives. Vanessa, what are your thoughts there?
Yeah, so obviously there are a number of salt alternatives that you can use, and there's a section in the best practice guide on this as well. So again, this is a case-by-case basis. You probably find that you can go a reasonable way without using salt replacers in the first instance. So I guess, and also from a clean label point of view and from a consumer perspective, they'll probably prefer you to go as far as you can before using those. So push as far as you can first and then use them if you need to. But they can be quite helpful, particularly in some of the more technical applications.
Is there anyone in particular that you wanted to talk about? I know that potassium
chloride is the most common one that's used, yeah, and obviously it's safe to use, and it's more of a consumer concern around the clean labels, but there's no, it can be used. So I guess it's just for individual manufacturers to sense check that, whether that's the right approach for them to take. So yeah.
Fantastic. Okay, and our next question is, should food service be reformulating as well?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Sure.
Food service should be reformulating. I mean, food service has its own unique challenges with the way that operationally it's set up. It's obviously different to manufactured foods, so it has its own challenges. And also its own sort of usage occasion, I guess, is slightly different than shop-bought foods. So it's a different arena, but there's no reason why the reformulation shouldn't be happening. The big challenge that I have come across with food service is the sort of competitor benchmarking element, and obviously we don't have readily accessible nutrition information for food service, although I think that that's improving, but that's a challenge in and of itself. You know, if you're a big pizza manufacturer, if we keep with the pizza theme, your competitors might not necessarily have the pizza content, the salt content of their pizzas on their websites, and even sometimes I found when you try to contact customer services, that's not necessarily available. So there are hurdles, and it's a different arena, but absolutely, it all needs to happen across the board. And in some ways, without the food service area moving in tandem with the manufactured foods area, it really can put the manufacturing sector at a bit of a disadvantage, I think, because we're not talking about a level playing field and everyone moving across the board. So,
Absolutely. The food services area is also being tackled via the Healthy Food Partnership process, is that right?
Well, the targets that we set were for manufactured foods for the Healthy Food Partnership, but there's no reason why, if you were, for example, a pizza manufacturer, we seem to be talking a lot about pizzas today, that you couldn't use the pizza-based salt target, for example, for your pizza. So I think from an ingredient level, when the food service are buying in their ingredients from suppliers, there's no reason why that they couldn't request or put a little bit of pressure on their suppliers to address their sodium content in their cheese or the sodium content in their processed meat or whatever it is. It's still cheese, it's still sausages at the end of the day from an ingredients point of view. So no reason why not.
Absolutely. Okay, we'll move to our next question. And the question is that there has actually been a bit of criticism about reformulation of processed foods not being helpful, and that we should focus on educating consumers not to eat processed foods. Can we comment on this?
Yep.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, completely. We're fully aware of that sort of criticism, if you like, or concern that the level of focus on reformulation, I guess, sort of reinforces the way the system is at the moment, rather than trying to shift people away from processed foods and onto more, fresh, local, seasonal, healthy foods. It depends, I think, on your. I don't want to be too philosophical, but I think it depends on your worldview and your ideology on this. I think reformulation is a pragmatic approach of something we can do now, but it's not mutually exclusive. It doesn't mean that because we're focusing on reformulation, we should not be doing all this other important work in the food system. We absolutely should. Yeah. And in some ways, reformulation it's hard, don't get me wrong, but it's a low-hanging fruit because there is so much work that's already gone on in this space overseas. And really, in its essence, what reformulation is asking is that manufacturers have a level of sort of attention and due diligence to the ingredients that they're putting within their products. And I don't think, I think most people would share that that's a good outcome, that there is a level of responsibility there for manufacturers to really think about the recipes and what we're feeding people on a mass level. So they're not mutually exclusive, and I completely agree that there's a lot of other big food system work and change that needs to happen. And in many ways, we just need to get on with the reformulation work. And that's why we're here today, so that we can, draw that line in the sand, share the information, share the expertise. So not that it's about excuses, but so that, we can enable and empower manufacturers, share this knowledge so that we can get on and do that, so that we can, of course, focus on all this other stuff.
Absolutely. And I'll just add from the partnership's perspective that reformulation is just one part of the puzzle, as Vanessa said. The most important part is to encourage people to eat fresh, to eat healthy, to cook for themselves. But if they are going to eat processed foods, it's to educate themselves and to look for those low salt products. So we encourage consumers to educate themselves to read the NIP and to look for foods that have up to 120 milligrams of sodium per 100 grams or up to 400 milligrams as well. But certainly the key message is, and the key work that needs to be done across the public health sector, is to encourage consumers to eat more healthily and to eat fresh and unprocessed foods, certainly. Okay, and the next question, we do, they're all coming through. What have we got now? We've got one around whether consumers are demanding lower salt products, or do we think that they still think salt-reduced products taste bad? Vanessa?
I think there's always going to be that inherent hurdle with this work, and this has existed as long as I've done reformulation, well over a decade now, that if you make a call out on your product that it's lower salt or lower sugar, that people assume that to be less tasty, even if you've done your sensory testing and know that it's great, if not better than the competition. So I don't know that you can really get over that bias. As I sort of alluded to in the presentation, I think that some categories can really use it to their advantage, and in those categories where consumers are, where health is higher up on sort of their value set, when they're figuring out what they want to buy, then of course it might be beneficial to call out the salt content, or that you've done some work on the salt content, because it's a point of difference. In the case of my pizza, I chose to just communicate improvements through the health star rating, because I think that's less overt in terms of calling out what consumers might perceive to be a negative thing, that it's got lower salt, lower sugar, therefore lower taste, flipping that over to be more of a positive thing. But you know, I think you can debate whether or not that is the case. If my pizza's only got a health star rating of 3, that may not be the case anyway. So are consumers demanding lower salt products? Consumers are obviously vested in their own health, and so as a general point of view, I think they are looking for healthier products, and they expect from a business responsibility point of view that businesses will have done the work to ensure that their products are as healthy as they can get them, really. I mean, you know, notwithstanding the fact we're talking about pizzas, so I don't think consumers are necessarily shopping for low salt pizzas, although I'm sure there's a small subsection of the population that would like that, but you know, broadly on a population level, they just want to be able to trust that brands have put the legwork in at the back end to make sure that they're as healthy as they can reasonably expect to get them.
Absolutely, absolutely. Okay, our next question is in relation to salt reformulation targets and the fact that they are coming imminently in Australia, and whether companies should wait for the targets or presuming they can get started and get ahead. That's an absolutely fantastic suggestion, Vanessa.
Yeah, well, I think that there's no, you know, even when targets come, which they will do at some point, that you may not have a target necessarily for your category. And as I said earlier, it doesn't, just the absence of a target does not sort of let you off the hook or mean that you shouldn't do the work or the focus in that area. A target is a really helpful leveler for the whole playing field, so everyone's working towards the same thing, but it doesn't preclude you going off and doing that work yourself, and it doesn't preclude you even going further than what the target is set. So I think absolutely that manufacturers do not need to wait, and there's plenty of international targets available and examples, and of course we shared the Healthy Food Partnership draft targets, and they of course may change. There's further discussions to be had there in terms of what that endpoint is, but they're a useful guide, I think, that people can access and see what they were set at, and they were based on looking at the market, looking at technical feasibility. So no reason why you can't look at those and use them, fully aware of the fact that things may change in future. But I guess the further you wait, also I think from a competitor point of view, how long do you want to wait? Because your competition might be, you know, hot on the heels with this and moving forward. So don't wait, like just do it. Start doing it, I think.
Absolutely. Yeah. Okay, and another question is just in relation to how do you actually go about conducting competitor benchmarking? I'm happy to answer that one if you like, Vanessa. And Vanessa did allude to all of the resources that are available to assist companies to benchmark their products in terms of salt levels with some competitor products on the market. So you can either go to the major supermarkets in Australia have the NIP labels on their databases. You can also use dedicated apps. The George Switch has an app and a resource called Food Switch. So if you just Google Food Switch, it's also linked in our how-to guide. And the George undertakes comprehensive research where they collect food from major supermarkets in Australia, and they basically have all of the data there in terms of nutrient composition. So definitely, if you're not benchmarking, you should be, and there are lots of free resources that can help you to do that. The next question is whether we have any advice on how to get through to senior management about the importance of reformulation. That's a great question. Thank you, Bob, for that.
Yeah, that's a great question, Bob. Yes, I've been through this a lot with in the past. So this is one, it's good to chat about over coffee, I think, because there's lots of different ways and it depends on your business. And I mean, at a very high level, you've obviously got a carrot or a stick approach to these where you can, and it depends on your business and it depends on their values and it depends on your product category and your pops. There's lots of factors to take into account here. We've obviously heard about the consumer side and the consumer argument and the consumer expectation and the business responsibility from a public health point of view. So there's all that sort of stuff that is helpful, I think, to set the scene that we've laid out today. From a more sort of practical sense, what I found helpful is when you do this work, I mean, I guess really we focused here on how do you actually set the target, what time frame do you use, what do you do? But the other thing is that sort of pulling together this as a strategy and saying, okay, well, I've looked at this, and I've done this recently for a business where you looked at, say, your 50 products and said, okay, this is where we are now, this is where we want to get to. If we invest and do this work, this is what it would mean. And total it up on a volume level is a really good way. So, for example, I may be making this up because it was a while ago now, but when I did the work at Asda, one thing that sticks in my head was 15,000 tonnes of sodium, and I think that's of salt that we removed from doing the breakfast cereals. Of course, the UK is a much bigger population than in Australia. You wouldn't get those sort of figures from doing that for a retailer here, but and that was like 30 London buses stacked on top of each other or something like that was very visual. So I think when you're saying, well, we're going to reduce the sodium in our pizza from 730 to 640, it's very hard to get senior management buy-in. But if you say, but actually if we do this work, these are the messages that we can share from a corporate social responsibility point of view, or we can put on our website, share with our shareholders, or just communicate in the press, or, build it up into a message that's more exciting, and get your sort of comms team involved early on, very much in the same way you would do with your labelling, I think. So.
Absolutely, and hopefully you can give your senior management a copy of our guide. Hopefully that will go some way to influence and encourage them. But as Vanessa said, basically consumers are demanding healthier foods, low salt reduced food. And the other thing I'd emphasise with senior management is that if you're not doing it, you will get left behind because your competitors will no doubt be doing it. And as we said earlier, all of the major food manufacturers are doing it, so there's absolutely no reason why you shouldn't be as well. I think we've covered most of the questions, so thank you so much for that level of engagement and interaction. If we don't have any more, we might just look at closing off the session and the webinar now. And I'd like to thank you all for participating and for listening today. The food category reports, the benchmarking reports by the George Institute, which actually rank highest and lowest salt levels in processed foods that contain a lot of salt on Australian supermarket shelves. And also you'll find full links on that website to all of the documents that we've referred to today. Can I just say you'll also be sent a quick link just after the webinar to complete a survey. Please do take the time to complete it. We value your input and we do hope that we can continue to improve our services in the reformulation space. So we'd love to hear how we can further help you in the future. I'd like to thank again Vanessa Clarkson for taking part today and for delivering not just the guide but this fantastic practical webinar. And just to close, if you have any further questions for us and for our team, you can email us. Please get in touch at unpackthesalt@heartfoundation.org.au. We're about to head off to have a low salt, healthy lunch. So on behalf of VicHealth, the Heart Foundation, the George Institute and all of our partners, thank you for your interest, for taking part, and we're really looking forward to keep working with the food industry to unpack the salt together. Thank you.